If you're frustrated with politics and the state of the world makes you feel powerless, listen to this till the end and you might leave feeling more emboldened, hopeful, and with a few ideas.
We have to protest this, we have to try and fight back. But if you're busy doing that all the time, then you're not also building what you do want. How do you want governance to function? How do you want your well-being to be supported?
Whatever political ideology you most identify with, wherever you are in the world, and even if you're satisfied with your representative's job, I bet you sometimes feel frustrated and disheartened by the spectacle we call politics. All we want is to feel safe and live our lives freely with its inherent highs and lows, and to fulfill our purpose if we feel like we have one. But when politicians make our world unsafe and keep disappointing, broken promise after broken promise, scandal after scandal, what can we turn to make our lives better, to create a future that makes sense to us? One that feels not only safe, but actually fun and exciting for as many people as possible. Well, today I'm talking to Professor Sasha Davis to learn how to break free from this seemingly airtight political system by doing what he calls replacing the state. So let's dive in, but first let me give some important information about the show for new listeners. Feel free to skip about a minute if you know the drill. Do you ever feel like every important conversation turns into just another petty debate and that we deserve better? Well, welcome to Make Sense, the show where I, singer-songwriter Leïla Six, interview people with super relevant and important insight to put our ideologies aside and make the most efficient decisions to build societies that actually make sense based on our shared values. I believe these are freedom and safety, which for humans comes from community. And by the way, whether you look at it scientifically or spiritually, community includes the entire planet. But these values can sometimes be a bit conflicting, which is tricky. So how can we shape a world that's both safe and exciting for everyone and on the largest scale possible? Well, that's a tough question and an ambitious goal, and it would be easy to get cynical about it and just say, well, the world's unfair, so I'll fight for my share and F the rest. But I don't want to do that, and I'm sure you don't either. So we need to understand topics that are fundamental to how the world works, complex topics that require our attention if we want to stay true to our values. Now, I tell all of my guests that I only want to have constructive, snark-free conversations here because I want everyone to feel welcome to learn, feel, and grow. So I'll ask the same of you in the comment section. Now, all that's been said, let's use our senses to make sense of the world and create more sensible societies. I know, it's too much wordplay, but I had to. Let my breath brush your ears. Inhale these words. May they fill your lungs and the atmosphere. So we're here to talk about replacing the state. And first of all, I think it's important to know, what is the state? Is it different from the government? Maybe you can tell us your little analogy, a boat analogy. I think it's really helpful to understand this.
Sure, yeah. So, the book, called Replace the State. And so one of the important distinctions that I have to make in the book is, what do I mean by the state versus the government? Because oftentimes in casual conversation, people might use the terms interchangeably. But really, in social science, they really make this distinction that goes all the way back to early Greek philosophy, where the state is the more durable kind of apparatus of kind of control and decision-making in a particular place or for a particular society that is longer than any particular government. So the analogy, like as you mentioned with the ship, is the idea that the state is like the ship and the government is its crew. Like the governments kind of come and go, but the state is the longer lasting apparatus that includes the courts and the police and the military. So it's not just like who may or may not have been voted in the last election. It's the more durable apparatuses of control in any society.
Yeah, and I think it's very helpful because it helps us really see the continuity of it all, because we don't think about necessarily, like you were saying, the police when we are voting, but it's really relevant to the topic to understand that continuity is the issue here. So to me, one of the main topics in the book is moving away from reactivity in activism. And for example, you talk about protests. So can you explain why they're a great tool for many things, but not so much to create positive change, precisely because they're too reactive?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, one of the main points of the book, or one of the main reasons I wrote the book, was a frustration with protest as not being terribly effective at creating real change. Now, that doesn't mean that protests don't do some things. They absolutely do, but they don't necessarily deliver the types of fundamental change that I think some people who protest hope that they would. And I think that there's some reasons for this. And part of it is that protest has a certain relationship to state power, in that oftentimes when you're protesting in the way that we usually think of it, right, there's different kinds of protests. But if you think about people going into the streets and waving signs and, also or maybe signing petitions or boycotts or this sort of thing, a lot of that is to ask the current state to do something different. It's still going to that state, right, so to the leadership of a country and saying, you're the proper authorities to make changes, and we're going and we're asking you to make that change. And so in a sense, it's not the people who want the change aren't in control. They're still kind of going and asking for somebody else to do this for them. And they may be saying, hey, do this or else, there's going to be some kind of consequence. We'll block traffic, or we'll, try and shame you publicly, or these sort of things. There's consequences and leverage. But oftentimes the fact that protests rely on the existing state to actually make the changes means they're not in a very big position of power, and governments ignore them all the time. And I think that's one of the lessons of a lot of the big protest movements that were of the 2010s, some of the Occupy, like Wall Street type protests, and even some of the Arab Spring protests, et cetera, is that many of these didn't end up with fundamental change. And it didn't really create a lot of fundamental change in governance, even if the people involved did get some things out of it and gain capacity and show that they didn't agree with the government and that there was widespread, resistance and things like that. So it does do some important things, but it doesn't necessarily make those governance changes.
If protests are not the most efficient method, then we might think a better approach is to vote for political representatives that seem the most aligned with our values. But again, in the book, you share 7 reasons why that is not necessarily the case. I guess it shows a huge failure of democracy because it should be the case. But yeah, you make several arguments, relevant arguments that it's not. So one of the reasons is that the state you live in might simply not be interested or incentivized to create positive change, at least the one you want. And can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I think it's not always self-evident.
Yeah, I think, and that's one of the reasons, again, for writing the book is, I see the audience for this book as really being folks who are interested in making positive social change, right? And who are frustrated that elections and protests aren't working. And I think that part of that reason why is because there's kind of a circular relationship between elections or electoral politics and protest. And they both still go to the same kind of conclusion that the current state is the proper arbiter of social affairs, that they're the ones that should make the change, and that you have these different ways of then affecting those people. One is you vote them in or out, or you protest, right, against them and ask them to make changes. The problem is, like in the first chapter, or the chapter 1 of the book, is that I kind of lay out, most democracies, and I'm using the United States really as the model there because that's where I'm kind of writing from, are so structurally flawed and structurally biased towards moneyed interests and supporting more capital accumulation and maintaining inequality and maintaining property relationships the way that they are, so that at a very fundamental level, you can't vote those things out particularly. And there's a lot of social power arrayed against being able to make a lot of changes through electoral politics. In the United States, for instance, the candidate that spends the most money on an election wins almost like 90% of the time. And so that means that, the politicians are following the desires of the people with the money that are going to fund their campaigns. And there's other reasons too. While structurally, they're just not in the business of creating fundamental social change that deals with inequality, because it kind of goes against the original mission of the government. Now, one thing I will add is that there are some theorists who have been frustrated with protests, and they say, no, we need to go back to the ballot box. But you have to remember, the reason you're protesting is because the ballot box didn't work in the first place. And so then you end up in this kind of chasing yourself in a circle, instead of recognizing that maybe you need to actually get some decision-making power and put it in some places that are not inside the state, which absolutely happens. But how do you do that more?
Right. And another reason not to always depend on the state to manage society, like you say in the book, and I had never thought about it this way, is the fact that our expectations for the state are just too high in the first place. And you remind us that sovereignty, that the state cannot control some major things that sovereignty depends on. So what are some of these things that the state just cannot control?
Yeah, I think there's the myth in the sense of sovereignty is that you have somebody in control, right? The sovereign who controls everything, right? That can make decisions, and, they can effectively say what comes in or out of a country, that what happens to the economic processes of a country, what social processes go on in a country. But that's not how it actually works, right? If a leader could actually control everything that could come in and out of the country, Trump wishes he could do that, right? But he can't. And that's why, in a sense, he's frustrated. That's why he's trying to build walls. That's trying to put up tariffs. It's because I think he recognizes actually the weakness of the state from being able to control those economic and social processes and migration and all those things, because they absolutely don't control it. And I think he's trying to reassert the power of the state because in his mind, he thinks the state should. And I think many people think that the state should be able to control society at kind of that scale. But I think we have lots and lots of examples where that's just not the case. And so when I'm talking about kind of questioning state power, going against it, you have to realize that it's not as monolithic and total as some people think it is. There's lots of stuff that goes on in any given place or society that the state really has no control over. And that's a good thing, right?
Yeah, I'll give a few examples from the book. The behavior of other countries, like that's a great example because we've seen that lately. Russia, for example, the stock market, obviously, which is supposed to be completely free, criminal activities, the movement on viruses, which I thought was very relevant also because everyone remembers that. So yeah, that's a good point that I have to admit I had never thought about before. So yeah, it was a good way of enriching my distrust in the state. I'm laughing, but distrusting your state isn't funny at all, really. A more honest reaction would be anger, I think. So let's welcome that anger with a snippet of a song called Fire. Stay until the end of the episode if you want to hear the rest of the song, or just look it up on any music platform. Tell me, is the world at war? Is it me? I think it's me. When I see nothing makes sense and no one's free, I think it's me. Tell me, is the world fractured? Is it me? I think it's me. When I see that hungry stay hungry, I think it's me. So I call on every river, every sea and every lake, 'cause I might break if I don't tame the fire in my heart. If I don't cool my anger, though it's all I've got. The other reason I really wanted to highlight here is the simple fact that states come and go, like they emerge and collapse through history. We've seen that, and in the book you wrote, the current state you live in may not be resilient enough to face the current crises, so it may not be the best recipient for your efforts. So if we don't want to simply react in a state of urgency when we see everything that's wrong in a system that may or may not survive the next crisis, and we want instead to create something more positive, we need a strategy, a long-term strategy, and that's what replacing the state is. So what does it actually look like? Is it necessarily the creation of a community that lives isolated from the rest of society? Can you maybe share an example of that from the book, maybe for those of us who've never witnessed the relational governance you talk about in the book,
okay.
and might struggle to really understand what that and replacing the state is?
Okay. Yeah, I think, kind of take this in a couple of pieces. I think that, first off, the idea that, folks that are trying to replace the state or, engaged in activities that I'm kind of categorizing as that type of action Really, it's about building alternatives to the state, and that can take many forms. That can be as much as like, kind of social associations and kind of more, kind of in a sense of more kind of cultural or fun activities, and just kind of like clubs and things like where you're having your needs met socially through outside of the state context. But it can also be things like people who are interested in building food security and networks of exchange and co-op forms of workplaces that are where people in the workplaces are essentially self-governing their workplaces, and then having relationships with other co-ops and making alternative networks of trade that go outside of kind of the capitalist system. And the reason for like developing these kinds of models is that, first of all, it makes life better now. It's better to be in a co-op where you have say over your working conditions. And the other thing, though, is that as the crises kind of mount and the power of states is going to be challenged by different crises and external actors and things like that, when the crisis comes, what are you going to fall back on? Because oftentimes people kind of go for a reassertion of the state in a way that's, fascist or very, very, authoritarian to try and get a handle on the situation, but of course causes a lot of oppression and usually death and more inequality. Or are you going to have an alternative that you've kind of built up before the crisis that gives you a framework, sort of a skeleton that you can kind of build on and network and have something that's a lot more egalitarian, where when the crisis moment comes, you have something that can kind of push forward and create those connections, and also, for people's material well-being, like really like, how are we going to deal with housing and food and those very simple things in a state of crisis? And I think that it's really important that there are organizations that are building these kinds of networks, and it's happening right now in lots of places where groups are doing this. And it's not just waiting for the crisis. It's also about making lives better now, and also giving people an alternative to the state, being able to protect people who are persecuted by existing states, reaching out with solidarity to places that are being, abused by current states, things like that. And so it has a lot of these really important functions even before the crisis. Now, the second part of your question, I think about like kind of, first of all, are these things isolated from society? No. They're usually quite tightly integrated into societies in terms of their not spatially like just way out in the mountains somewhere or whatever. They're inside of our communities. They're making connections, even though they are running some parallel circuits of exchange and things like that. And the other thing about it is that a lot of times where these are the strongest right now are in indigenous communities, places where there is a longstanding tradition of a different way of living, different authority structures, different ways of relating with the natural environment. And so these are places where they look at the current state of governance and they said, this particular place used to be governed differently because it was, and usually not that long ago, pre-colonization. So they have something to point to where it's not just sort of a utopian dream. There can be like, no, we know how to live differently in a more egalitarian and more responsible way. We used to do it right here. And so in those communities, there's a little more of a base and a model for how you kind of deal with the current crises. And so that's, I think, important, which would lead me to, I guess, the third point, which is the relational governance piece. The relational part is about this idea that in one of the chapters, I really kind of break down like types of governance into two kind of simplistic sort of, types. One of them, the imperial type, which is essentially assumes that whoever's in charge controls everything and can bend the earth to its will, right? That they can, and if you run out of resources, it's okay. We'll just go to the next valley and then take over those resources, and then the next valley and take over those resources, that you don't have to really be sustainable, and that you can kind of bend the earth to the will of the sovereign, whoever's in control. That's like the imperial model.
That's the infinite state also, right?
Yeah, and I kind of refer to that as the infinite state. It assumes the ability to grow infinitely over space. It assumes it will last forever. And it also assumes that resources can just be used infinitely, forever, and that you're not going to run into any problems with running out or scarcity. And of course, all three of those things are wrong, but it's an illusion that's created temporarily under that kind of form of governance where people, think that
That's
they're
why
going to
I
last
like
forever.
the term infinite, because it is not science-based.
No.
It shows that this whole framing just it doesn't add up.
No, it's a mythological, and you also it gets to kind of its logical, most extreme conclusions with the tech oligarchs that are like, okay, and then we're going to go to Mars, right? And then we're going to go and we're going to build cities on new islands that are all, it's like it goes to places where, but it's still always about control, 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 and infinite growth, and we never have to think in balance with anything. The flip side to that is the relational governance, which is more about, governing in relationship, where people are thinking about the relationships between themselves, but also between themselves and the natural environment, and thinking about, okay, how are we going to live in this particular place 7 generations, 10 generations, 15 generations in a way that's actually good for the well-being of ourselves as well as the environments on which we depend. And that is a totally different mindset. And that is one that a lot of these groups that are doing what I kind of refer to as replace the state are kind of angling their governance towards that sort of it's a very different mindset.
When I read that in the book, I was like, oh yeah, so responsible.
Yes.
Like relational and just responsible.
Mm-hmm.
And going back to that, moving away from reactivity, you talk about prefiguration, which basically means focusing on what you want to build instead of what you want to destroy. Why is that so important with replacing the state or counter occupations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's important because I think a few very important things happen when you focus on production as opposed to reacting to what the government is doing at any given moment. One is that governments are just putting out outrageous things, and people are just responding like, oh my God, I can't believe they did that. I can't believe they did that. We have to protest this. We have to try and fight back. But if you're busy doing that all the time, then you're not also building what it is that you what you do want. How do you want governance to function? How do you want your daily life to sort of happen? How do you want your well-being to be supported? And that takes a mental shift to, okay, well, what is it we actually want? And not only is it, I think, more effective in the long run because you're able to then build capacity for those better ways of living, but it also, I think, includes more people in your project, because a lot of people, you might get into political debates with people about, government policy X, Y, or Z. But I think when you talk to people about like, hey, maybe, we should have affordable housing, you actually get a pretty broad swath of the population is absolutely in support of that. Very few people are like, I think housing should be unaffordable except for the best people. Like, people don't really say that. And so it's also a way to kind of overcome a lot of the political polarization when you focus on, well, what do we want? Because we actually agree on quite a bit. We may not agree about how you get there. Like, how do we make affordable housing happen? But we can all agree, like, that's a worthwhile goal. And that, keeping property in these relationships of capital where the price of it just has to go up and up and up, again, goes back to the infinite state, right? It just has to become, is of course always going to price everybody out of being able to have shelter. And so, but instead of just sort of yelling about that, finding ways of productively doing things like community land trusts or squatting or other kinds of techniques to address the issue in a productive manner, I think has a lot of really positive effects in the long term.
And like you were saying before, I think it's also very valuable because it creates a safety net. There are people who actually wish for the collapse like as soon as possible without actually putting a lot of energy into creating alternatives for when it does happen, even though it actually happens all the time and it's a long process and it's not like one event that's going to happen one day. But I think it's like if these people had it their way, there would be so much suffering. Mm-hmm. So I like that yeah, it also contributes to that safety net, to that safety against our worst instincts in times of crisis. So yeah.
Yeah, I would say, to me just to add to, like, it's about creating change with security, right? As opposed to, I think there are some people and some theorists who think that the way you make social change happen is you drive the system to maximum instability and then you topple it. Sometimes with very little thought about, and then put what in next. And that's because I think that unfortunately, typically, historically opens the door to very authoritarian sort of responses, unless you have laid a lot of groundwork for, okay, I'm not necessarily opposed to destabilizing the current capitalist state, but you better have something else that is handling human well-being to replace the state, right? Like kind of the theme of the book. Because I think that just saying, well, we'll topple it and we'll figure it out later is a recipe for disaster, both on a human scale, but also politically.
Yeah, absolutely. So you talked about like alternative ways of managing land and trade and things like that, but you also talk about blockades and types of occupation in the book. And for a lot of people, when we think of blockades and this type of activism, we generally picture violence. And you say that replacing the state is not violent, but life-affirming. So for someone like me who's never been to such a place where the state is being replaced, can you paint a picture, like tell us what kind of activities take place in these spaces?
I think one of the things too is, and you've mentioned this word a couple of times, and just for the listeners, the term counter-occupation, right? I use that specifically because a lot of the places where these occur are already occupied, right? I mean, these are areas where there's a colonial government is essentially in control, and a lot of the people in the areas don't actually have full representation within the existing governance structure. And so they see themselves as already occupied. So when they go and set up what we might call an activist occupation, they're saying it's a counter occupation or a liberation of those places that are currently occupied. So I think that's why I kind of use that term counter occupation to emphasize that these places are in a sense already occupied, but just by what we might think of as the traditional state, but one in which has been placed in an imperial manner in many parts of the world. So in terms of like what these particular spaces are like, I'll say that a lot of times these actions start as a no against something. They're against a project. I talk about the 30-meter telescope protests on the Big Island of Hawaii. I talk about military-based construction in Okinawa and in South Korea, nuclear weapons testing in Nevada. And all these protests start with they're against something. They don't want the new base. They don't want the telescope. They don't want nuclear testing. But what happens fairly quickly in these encampments that kind of occupy or blockade roads or, try and stop construction projects is that a life develops within those spaces that is an affirmation of what they do want, right? And so and this happens, like I said, fairly quickly, and of course is usually very much informed by the ways of life that are common in those places. So like in the Hawaiian communities, of course, they're that's going to be saturated with Kanaka Maoli, which is indigenous Hawaiian, cultural practices and ideologies and governance structures, right? And so they start to make the life in the camp operate the way they would like to see all the islands kind of be governed in a post-colonial setting. And that is actually a fairly peaceful operation because, if anything, it definitely is a much more humane way of governing that is taking human well-being and environmental well-being into account in a way that the regular state is not doing right now. Now, where the violence, of course, happens is with the conflict with the current state, on the blockade line. And in many of these, in the examples that, I've witnessed, of course, a lot of these blockades are defensive in nature, or they are trespassing, but in a way that's not, attacking the person, that's on the other side. They're like, we're just going to go put ourselves in this place and say we have a claim to this. And then often the state will respond with some violence in that process. But in most of the protests that I've been to, the responses of the protesters are not violent. They are defensive in nature. And there's that's important because I think that you gain more legitimacy and you gain more support by doing so. In a sense, you gain leverage. And that is sort of a Gandhian sort of perspective that goes back to other, kind of people in different protest movements. But I think what's important is that oftentimes is to recognize that oftentimes these protests really become very, very, very big when the authorities, the governments attack them in a way that people see as being really illegitimate. Like people in the larger society see this as being illegitimate, and they come to support the protesters and their rights and their ability to do things. And so that can be a powerful weapon in being able to maintain the occupations, but to also get the word out about them and to spread the ethic of this is what they're trying to do, so that even if that particular occupation doesn't last, those ideas and practices are there for the next one, right? And that definitely happens where they resurface in a lot of these places over years. It's
true that the few images that I've seen of occupations in France, in my country, so they're called ZAD, stands for Zones to Defend. They really look more like eco-villages, and they start to look like war zones when the police arrive. So yeah, there is a connection there. And I was really impressed by the example in the book of the blockade that consisted in a Catholic mass.
Yeah.
So that's really not violent.
Yeah, and that was in South Korea. Yeah.
Okay, we have a few ideas and tools to take back our power as people, but like any powerful tool, replacing the state can be dangerous if done in the wrong way. So come back for part 2 to learn about those risks and how to avoid them, and for a movie recommendation. Here's a snippet.
Exclusion is not just the problem of the right.
Even within the left, there is so much purity culture. Violent people might get inspired to replace the state by force and ignore laws and protections and even human rights. Can you maybe just give us a few rules for doing it in a legitimate and constructive way? In the meantime, you can get some extra information and listen to the song you heard today at the end of the episode, or just find it on any music platform. You can find Sasha Davis on his Substack called Make the New World, and you can find his book, Replace the State, pretty much everywhere online. I hope you got some valuable insights from this episode, and if you want to learn more from my guests, you'll find everything you need in the show notes. I, for one, thank you for your attention. I know you could have been watching or listening to a billion other things, and I'm glad you picked this one. Now, 3 things before I leave you. Number 1, if you liked the music you heard today, you should look me up on the music platform you use. There will also be a link in the show notes to help you find me on there. Number 2, if you want to help me make the internet a place for more constructive and nuanced conversations, you can subscribe, like the episode, share it, and leave a comment or review depending on where you're listening to this. And number 3, you can also subscribe to my free Patreon, to my free newsletter Night Sky, and follow me on Instagram or TikTok to understand a bit better the messages behind my songs. Again, everything will be in the show notes. All right, thank you, and take care, and keep trying to make sense. Tell me, is the world burning? Friction.